It was like a tobacco chewer suddenly realizing that he had been away too long from his pouch. Margaya took a pinch of snuff. At the sight of it, a police officer sitting next him held out his fingers and Margaya passed him the box. The officer took a deep pinch, felt grateful and became communicative. Things are not quite good, yet, you know.
Yes, of course, replied Margaya, thinking it best to be agreeable with a policeman in plain clothes. All kinds of bothers, he said. People will not leave us in peace.
Margaya looked about cautiously and said, can't you put them in their places? Yes, said the policeman. That's what keeps me on the move like this.
My home is in Madras, but I don't get even a couple of hours a month to spend with my family. I have to be on the move constantly. Well, they think I have a nose for wrongdoers, political, criminal, or whatever. Well, it's a dangerous job, I suppose, Margaya said, opening his eyes wide.
The policeman adjusted himself in his seat more comfortably and said, well, it all depends how we view it. I have been in it for 20 years and have survived. Well, one must do one's duty, said Margaya, generalizing.
As they say in Bhagavad Gita, God helps those who do their duty. The other leaned forward and said, do you know I had to carry a notice of arrest even to Mahatma Gandhi once? I would rather have prostrated before that man, but I had to arrest him.
Such is life. He philosophized vaguely, sleepily. Margaya noticed his sleepiness and said, but they ought to give you a second-class pass at least.
This tickled the policeman considerably. I can travel first, if I like, nobody will question me. I am really an officer, you know.
But what will be the use? I'm not traveling in order to sleep comfortably. That's why I travel third. My catches are almost all in a third-class carriage. Sometimes I have to follow political suspects, sometimes brigands, sometimes murderers, all kinds of things. They can assign me any job, but it is always necessary for me to keep wide awake and stay in a crowd.
Most of the others in the compartment had gone to sleep. Only these two were awake. Margaya confided to him his troubles.
I don't know where to go in Madras, or even what to do. Have you got the card with you? Asked the policeman. Margaya took it out of his pocket.
The policeman examined it by the dim, insect-ridden light of the compartment. Looking carefully at the postmark, he said, it's from Parktown. Margaya asked, where is that?
The inspector ignored his question, and asked, this handwriting must also be analyzed. He turned the card and said, how long will you stay in Madras? I don't know, Margaya said pathetically, refraining from adding, they have pushed me out on this journey.
I don't know where I'm going. I would not even know Madras when I arrived there. The police officer took charge of Margaya as soon as they arrived in Madras Egmore station. He took him to the waiting room and said, make yourself at home.
There is the platform restaurant. You can rest as much as you like. I will be back.
Give me that postcard. He spoke to a platform official about Margaya. Margaya began to doubt how far he ought to trust the man.
Perhaps he would throw him in jail, or perhaps he was a brigand himself. He was gradually changing his mind about wanting the man's help. In the cold, morning light of Madras, things seemed different and more reassuring. There was a certain hopelessness in the dim-lit compartment, which made him want to confide in someone and enlist his sympathy.
But now it all seemed different. He reflected, why not run away from here? Suppose he opened the door on the off side and cleared out.
But the police officer gave him no chance. He said, taking him by the sleeve, don't move out of here till I come back. I will see what I can do for you.
Oh, no, I wouldn't bother you, said Margaya, trying to withdraw. The other paid no heed, but just turned round and went away. Why should anyone be so considerate to a stranger?
Margaya's devious mind kept ringing, particularly in this city, which is notoriously cold-blooded. After food, Margaya stretched himself on a bedstead in the waiting room and slept soundly. He snored so loudly that the people moving about the platform stopped and looked in.
Margaya dreamt that he had got down at Mempi, and someone whom he could not recognize pointed up to the sunlit horizon, and said, all that is yours. Margaya was struggling to work up the interest rate on this proposition and was involved in a terrible quantity of figures when the police officer came in again and woke him up. Margaya felt very apologetic for having fallen asleep.
He said clumsily, you see, I am sorry. There is nothing to apologize about, said the inspector. Well, if you like to have a wash, let us go out.
Margaya got up and went round with him in search of a tap. The Madras heat seemed to prick him in a dozen places. He felt better after he emerged from under the tap.
He went back to his room dripping, tidied himself up, and put on a long coat and turban. In the heat of Madras, it was like getting into steel armor and helmet. The inspector said, Well, I have good news for you.
He returned the postcard to Margaya and said, I have spent the whole day tracing the author of that postcard. It's a falsehood he has written. Margaya's mind was still clouded with sleep and calculations of interest.
He looked dull and uncomprehending. The inspector held out his hand for a pinch of snuff. Give me your snuff.
It's very good, and I will tell you what you should do. You go back to your wife at once and tell her that your son is alive. How do you know?
Margaya asked, still dazed. Because we've managed to trace it back to the author. He is a madman in Parktown who keeps writing messages like that to any address that he picks up.
How did he pick up my address? Well, that's what we shall investigate, if you will stay for another day, said the inspector. The inspector took him along to a house in Parktown.
It was a very big house in a lane, occupying the space of 3 or 4 blocks together. Its outside was painted green and red in alternating strips with oil distemper. Its front veranda was enclosed by iron rods painted yellow. The whole scheme made the house look like a crayon box with its lid open.
Over it all was hung a board painted, The House of Enlightenment. It was a hot, dusty afternoon, and the taxi had run through several winding lanes. Seeing so much gaudy color made Margaya's throat parched and thirsty. It also made him feel homesick.
Before the car came to a halt, the inspector said, I was able to trace this man through the post office. Don't be surprised by anything you may see or hear. We are going out to meet a madman, remember. He is a very wealthy man, gone mad.
He owns a theater, and his relations are managing it. They got down. He knocked on the door.
An attendant opened the door and showed the way. They went through several pillared halls. The pillars were of smooth granite, and the floors mosaic covered.
Potted ferns were kept here and there. Some parrots and miscellaneous birds were twittering in the cages hanging down from the ceiling. The house was so deep inside that the noises of the city came in from far off, completely muffled.
The place was cool and shady. All along the walls of the corridors and passages and halls there were pictures of gods in terrible shape and fury destroying the world. Margaya felt he was in an utterly strange world.
The world of Vinayak Mudali Street, of his wife and brother, and Market Road, and banking, seemed to be distant and unreal. The inspector whispered to him, Don't you feel that you are in a zoo? Yes, said Margaya, just to please him, although he did not know what it looked like inside a zoo. They were now in a large hall where a man sat on a divan, surrounded by cushions.
He wore an ochre robe and had grown a beard. From 2 tall incense holders smoke was curling. The man had about him a heap of postcards, a pen and a writing pad.
He was writing furiously when they entered. He had an attendant fanning him, although there was an electric fan above. There were 2 seating cushions along the wall.
The man took no notice of the arrival of the visitors. The inspector whispered to Margaya, Take your seat there. They sat on the cushions and waited.
The attendant bent over and whispered into the ear of the big man. He put away the pen, leaned back and looked at the inspector. The inspector salaamed.
The other's face relaxed a little, and a smile hovered about it, but the next moment it became rigid again as he said, Who is that mortal next to you who does not seem to recognize us? Is it likely that we are invisible to his eyes? Yes, that's so, said the inspector.
That's the correct explanation. Oh, it never occurred to me. I can make myself seen.
We often forget that we divine creatures are transparent, and that we cannot be seen. But it is easily remedied, if your holiness makes up his mind. The other shook his head in approval, then waved his arm, looked at Margaya, and asked, Do you see me?
The inspector muttered, Salute him. Yes, replied Margaya with a reverential salam. Now, what is your business, mortal?
The inspector said, He has come after his son Balu, about whom a card has emanated from here. He held up the card and said, He wants to know in which world to look for him. The other shook his head and said, "That I am not allowed to say."
"That only God can do. I am not God, but only God's agent." He ordered, "Go and prepare the world for my coming."
"That I am doing. I write every day to every king, ruler, viceroy, president and minister in the world, that their boss is soon arriving, and let them get ready for it. Every day I write to President Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill, particularly."
He indicated a big file of letters waiting to be posted. The inspector said, "That's fine, but we want to know the whereabouts of Balu. He is not a Maharaja or anything like that, and it is enough for us to know in which world he is to be found."
"Will you please look up the necessary reference? Is this his earthly father?" "Yes," said the inspector.
"Does he believe in death?" "He does not," replied the inspector. "I am very pleased about it.
It's my mission in life to inform at least 10 mortals about death each day and educate them. People must learn to view death calmly." Of course," said the inspector and added, "Please look into your file."
The other took out a ponderous file, turned over its leaves, muttering, "Balu. Balu. Son of Malgudi." Margaya could hardly believe his ears. He cried involuntarily, "How did you get my address?" The inspector suppressed him with a gesture and said, "Where did you pick up this mortal's address?"
"How do I pick up George VI's address or Mahatma Gandhi's address?" He answered back, "Whenever anyone comes to me for charity, I will not give them an anna unless they give me their true address.
Whenever anyone comes to me for employment in any of my businesses, I won't take him in unless he gives me his true address." "How do you know it is his true address?" "By writing a card to that address," the other said triumphantly.
"You must not forget that there is God above me. Did this boy come to you for employment? Didn't he?
Or for charity?" "I don't believe in charity. Whenever anyone comes to me for charity, I give them employment."
"But when they come to you for employment, I give them charity," the other said. "Where is this Balu?" persisted the inspector.
"You may persist for 1,000,000 years, but you will not get a reply unless God sanctions an answer." "Hasn't he sanctioned it?" asked the inspector. "No," replied the madman.
"In that case we are going," said the inspector, rising. The inspector walked away unceremoniously. Margaya hesitated for a moment at the door, and then followed the inspector out.
"What are we to make of it?" asked Margaya. "Don't worry. Your son is living somewhere."
"We'll have to find that out. We will do it. Don't worry."
"How do you know that my son still lives?" "Because I know this man. Every day he writes 10 death notices and sends them to the post.
His servants usually do not post them, but your one card must have slipped through into the ordinary post. My misfortune is that he should have got at my address." Margaya wailed, suddenly realizing, "It's 3 days since I went to my office.
God knows what is happening to my business. Probably this is the beginning of the end," he reflected ruefully. The inspector took Margaya to the Central Talkies that evening.
The manager rose in his seat when the inspector entered his room. The police were a troublesome lot and it was best to keep on good terms with them.